welcome our keynote speaker, Max
Thank
Stoiber.
you. Just to make sure everything's working, is there anybody called Michael in the room? If you're called Michael, can you raise your hand? All right, awesome. That concludes my mic check. Thank you, thank you. I love how one person in the front raised their hand. That's awesome. Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about the past, present, and future of CSS-in-JS. Now, my name is Max. Like she said, I came all the way from Austria. I currently work at Gatsby. So if you have any troubles with Gatsby, if you have any issues with it, please don't come talk to me. I just started working there 3 weeks ago. Previously, I was at GitHub, another site you might know. And I'm most widely known for creating a bunch of open source projects like Styled Components and React Boilerplate and Polished and some others that you might know. I love open source, and that's kind of what I'm here to talk to you about today.
We're just in extended here.
What's the problem?
It's extended.
Okay.
Yep.
This should work then, right?
It's okay. Don't worry.
Apparently my mic check wasn't successful.
So we're in this one. Let's
Can
There
I?
you go. What are we looking
I was a bit too keen. I really
Oh,
wanted
yeah.
to get off stage as quickly as possible. I'm sorry for that.
for? No, I don't.
So he traveled out of state for the conference. Ooh, oh my God. Joe, wow. Welcome to Sydney. It's okay. It's no Melbourne. I don't know. Melbourne's all right. Weather's okay, I guess. Yeah, overcast. I don't know. Like, you can maybe come back next week. It'll probably be better. But who
connected
traveled
to
out
the
of country?
First one.
We'll unplug it and
Oh,
plug back in and it should.
Australia's pretty good, I think. Yeah. You guys enjoying it? Yeah. Oh, nice. Well, anyway, how are you guys going? Yeah. 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 Well, that's fine. Yeah. Oh, unicorn gay time. Yes. We were discussing this actually, like for real. Look, I don't know. There's all the new flavors of the gay time, like the salt gay time, and like I don't know. There's the classic. To me, I don't know. Honeycomb, salty. Oh, I don't know. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But yes. But so.
All right,
Oh.
we're fixed up.
Oh,
Sorry
good.
about that.
I mean, I've got so much more to say, but.
There you go. I'm sorry for kicking you off. Sorry about that. Anyways, I'm Max. If you want to follow me anywhere, Twitter, GitHub, Instagram, at MXSDBR, which looks way more difficult than it actually is. It's just my name without the vowels. So if you remember my name, Max Stoiber, take out the vowels. You'll have my handle pretty much everywhere. So I'm here to talk today with you about CSS-in-JS. Now, first I want to show you what CSS-in-JS looks like in case you've not seen it. This is styled components. We define a title component that is a styled H1 that has a color of pale violet red and a font size of 24 pixels. We can then use this component throughout our React application, and it'll render an H1 that has a color of pale violet red and a font size of 24 pixels. What this actually looks like in the DOM, and please watch the slides because this is a very quick animation, is that the CSS gets hashed and gets a unique class name that is then applied to the H1. That way, you get a bunch of benefits. Specifically, there's a couple of reasons why I like CSS-in-JS. The first one is confidence. I can practically add, change, and delete any CSS I want, and I know it's not going to have any unintended consequences. Because every piece of CSS is bound to a specific component, I know it's only ever going to change that specific component and nothing else. That leads to very painless maintenance. I never have to go on the hunt for a weird class name somewhere in my dozens of style sheets that affects my component somewhere way down the tree. All the styling that affects that one component is just right there inline, and that's all of it. And I know it is all of it all the time. There's another very important point here, which is because every piece of CSS is bound to a specific component, when I delete that component, all of its CSS will be gone too. That means I never end up with append-only style sheets, if you know what that is. If you've ever worked in a large code base with a not very well-maintained CSS architecture, you'll have seen the append-only style sheets where you can't really change anything about the existing CSS, so you just keep adding stuff at the bottom, never changing anything. That can never happen with CSS-in-JS at all, because whenever I delete anything, whenever I change anything, only that specific component is affected. That is awesome for teamwork, because not everybody in my team has an encyclopedic understanding of CSS, right? Not all of them are experts at CSS. And by using CSS-in-JS, we avoid a bunch of common problems like naming collisions, weird overrides. We don't have any specificity issues that otherwise might pop up, right? We're essentially helping them move in the right direction. This is particularly valuable if you have a bunch of juniors on your team who are very unfamiliar with CSS, right? This way, they're essentially guided towards the right thing. The next point is fast performance, which some people might disagree with. I'll tell you why I think that CSS-in-JS is great for performance. We can keep track of which components you actually use, which means we never inject more CSS than you actually use. So if you're server-side rendering, the style sheet that you're sending over the wire is the critical CSS for every single one of your pages. No matter which pages your user hits, they only ever get the least amount of code possible. It doesn't get much faster than that. And then it's also great for dynamic styling. If you have any theming needs, if you have any sort of multi-tenant application, theming in CSS-in-JS is highly dynamic, and you can pretty much change anything at any point in time, which is awesome. The big overarching point of CSS-in-JS is that it guides you to the pit of success, right? It guides you toward the right direction. That doesn't mean you can't fuck it up, but you're going to avoid a bunch of problems that you might have had otherwise. So that's why I like CSS-in-JS and why I've invested a bunch of years into building different libraries that are now pretty widely used, like style components. So at the moment, 60% of React installs also install a CSS-in-JS library. Which specific one that is isn't important, but almost 2/3 of all React apps are built with CSS-in-JS, and particularly lots of big companies use CSS-in-JS for their design systems and for their apps, which is great to see. However, this wasn't always this way, right? And so I want to go back a little bit and talk to you about how we came here. It really started out in 2014. In November of 2014, two important things happened. The first one was that Oleg from Berlin published the very first ever CSS-in-JS library called JSS. Now, JSS was way ahead of its time, way ahead of its time. To this day, the rest of the CSS-in-JS libraries are still picking up on the things that Oleg built 6 years ago, which is incredible. The other important thing that happened was that Ed Vigeux, who worked at Facebook or who still works at Facebook on the React team, gave a talk at a small conference in Washington, D.C. called Nation.js. And he talked about how Facebook uses CSS-in-JS to manage styling at scale. That talk blew up in the web dev world. If you were on Twitter back then, that was the only thing you would see for pages and pages and pages. All of them basically call him a complete idiot, and what the hell Facebook was thinking. It was super controversial at the time. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, 6 years later, we know that it's worked out kind of well. But at the time, everybody just thought, what the hell is this guy doing? Then in January of 2015, Formidable Labs introduced another CSS-in-JS library that worked slightly differently than all the others. So what Radium did was that it added inline styles. So rather than injecting a class name into the DOM, they were actually adding a style attribute with all of the CSS in it. Now, if you've ever used a style attribute, you know that you can't do all of the things that you want to do with it. There's no media queries, there's no pseudo selectors, none of the advanced CSS magic that you can do can be done with inline styles. So Radium tried to hack around that with JavaScript, but again, with the benefit of hindsight, we now know 6 years later, 5 years later, that that wasn't the best approach. Radium was an awesome step along the way, because otherwise we might still be exploring this approach nowadays. In February of 2015, Brent Jackson launched Rebase. He's sitting in the audience somewhere, so if you see him, tell him he's awesome, because Rebase is awesome. To this day, a great library that really introduced and popularized the CSS Components API, where you have a box component that you add CSS props to, like color blue or something. In May of 2015, CSS modules was announced by another person who's in the room, Mark Dalglish and Glenn Mattern. CSS modules isn't technically CSS-in-JS, but I'm still mentioning it because what they did was that they popularized outputting unique class names. So the way CSS-in-JS and CSS modules work is they basically hash your CSS and use that as a class name, which means you're never going to get any class name duplication, because if two class names are the same, their CSS has to be the same, which was huge and awesome. Again, CSS modules, super awesome, still used by tons of people. A couple months later, in September, we got CS-JS. It's a tiny library that not many people actually know about. It never really went anywhere and is sort of deprecated now. But they were the first ones to let you write CSS as actual CSS in your JavaScript. Previously, all of the libraries made you write your CSS as JavaScript objects. And CS-JS let you write CSS the way you used to, which was very nice, but it never picked up any steam. In October, we then got Aphrodite. Khan Academy built their own CSS-in-JS library that really popularized critical CSS extraction. So they were the first ones to realize that actually, because we know which components are used, we can just inject the most minimum set of styles possible, right? Which was huge for their performance across their web app. And again, Aphrodite was super awesome back then, still super awesome today, still used by tons of people. In June, Robin Fishman then built and announced Fella, which really popularized this notion of your style being a function of your state. Just like React popularized your view being a function of state, with Fella you could now dynamically update all of your CSS based on what your state is, which is huge and works very well with the React way of thinking about state. In July, Sunil Pai then announced Glamour. What Sunil really did was that he dug deep on performance. And there's this very obscure DOM API that you've probably never used called insert rule. And with insert rule, what we did before was that we just injected a style tag into the DOM, and then we set its text contents to whatever we wanted the CSS to be. What Sunil found is that we can use this insert rule API to insert CSS into the DOM much, much quicker, because we just skip the entire DOM and go straight to the CSS DOM. That was huge for performance. Glamour nowadays is kind of deprecated. Sunil doesn't really work on it anymore, and he recommends other libraries now. But it was super awesome at the time. It's still, honestly, still an awesome library today. In October, JSX style was launched, 2016 now, where they essentially took the Rebase CSS Components API and went even further and added practically the ability to write any CSS as props on a component. Again, JSX style, super awesome, still being used, great library. In the same month, I got on stage at React NL in the Netherlands, and I announced, together with Glenn Mattern, style components. And what we really did was that we popularized this styled.div API, which previously hadn't existed. Now, style components, obviously, still awesome. Super best library ever. Just use style components. Forget about all the others. I'm not even sure if I'm talking about any of the others. I'm just kidding. No, style components still being developed. I use it, but, you know, just saying. I'm just kidding. 2 months later, Ryan Tsao, who built the CS-JS experiment at the very start, then announced Styletron. He works at Uber, and they needed their own CSS-in-JS solution. And so he built Styletron. And what Styletron really did was that it popularized outputting atomic classes. So if you know what atomic CSS is, it's like every class is one rule. So you have a class name for margin top 0. You have a class name for color blue, right? And what Styletron does is it takes your normally written CSS and it compiles it down to atomic CSS to limit the amount of CSS that is output and give you even more performance. Same month, the Zeit team announced Style.jsx, which they built into Next.js. Now, Style.jsx is really great for lowering the barrier. They essentially mimic a style tag. So you can write a style tag in your React app, and it will actually take those class names and make them unique, which is super great because it lowers the barrier for CSS-in-JS immensely, right? You're writing CSS like how you're used to. And then Style.jsx comes along and makes it all unique and fixes it all for you. In March of 2017, almost half a year later, we got AstroTurf. And AstroTurf was the first CSS-in-JS library to take this concept of composing and writing your CSS in JavaScript, but then they extract it out to a static .css style sheet that you serve as a normal file, which for some applications works really well. A little bit later, Kenzie Dodds at PayPal announced Glamorous. And what Glamorous really did was style components had sort of taken off at that point, and we only allow you to write CSS as strings, the way you're used to writing CSS. And so Glamorous went ahead and it took that, but had the same style.div API, but let you write CSS as objects, because Kent preferred that. Now, Glamorous nowadays is no longer maintained, and Kent really recommends other libraries, but Glamorous was a super awesome step and pushed everybody else to also support, like us, CSS as JavaScript objects. Then in May of 2017, I put style components v2, but the important part about style components v2 isn't actually style components. It's stylus. There's a guy down in Africa somewhere called Thai Sultan, and he built a CSS parser in JavaScript that is super tiny, super fast, and super reliable. It's called Stylus, and we switched to it with v2, which essentially cut our bundle size by 90% or something, and made us much, much more performant. And all of the other CSS-in-JS libraries now also use Stylus. Honestly, all of these performance benefits, all of that wouldn't be a thing if it weren't for Stylus, which is, I've never met him, but I still want to give him a hug because he is incredible. Then in July, we got Emotion, also by Mitchell and Kai. Mitchell's also in the audience somewhere. We've got lots of CSS-in-JS people here, just realized. That's awesome. Emotion really kicked off a huge performance competition. At the time, all of the CSS-in-JS libraries were sort of like, yeah, sure, performance, it's cool, we like performance. And then Emotion came onto the scene and was like, we're 10 times faster than everybody else. What are you guys doing? Why aren't you this fast? And to this day, everybody, to their credit, everybody's gone much, much faster now. We're now at a point where everybody's practically the same speed, everybody's super fast. But at the time, that wasn't the case. And thanks to Emotion, they really kicked the whole community in the butt and were like, you guys, you gotta work on this. You're slow, we're fast. A couple months later, we got Linearia, which took the AstroTurf idea of taking CSS and extracting it into a static style sheet even further with the Style Components API. Again, still awesome, still being used. Then a year later, in November of 2018, we got Emotion v10. And the reason I call out Emotion v10 is because they introduced and popularized the CSS prop API. So they now let you put the CSS prop on any element that you write, and you just write your CSS in there, which is an awesome API and that nobody really thought of before. And then again, almost a year later, in June of 2019, we got ThemeUI, which also Brent Jackson built, who's still in the audience. ThemeUI really took this concept of theming and took it a step further by adding interoperability and sort of really popularizing this idea of sticking to a very strict theme shape so that you could interoperate with any given component. Now, as I'm speaking about all of these libraries here, you'll notice I love all of them. I don't care which one you use. All of them are great, right? This community from the outside might look like we're all constantly bashing each other and hitting each other over the head. But really what's happening is that all of these people, we all collaborate with each other all the time. We're pushing each other to invent new APIs, to get faster, to talk to people and realize what they want. It's awesome. I'm so glad to be a part of this awesome group of people pushing the web forward. Now, that's cool and all, but what's the future? And the answer is, I don't know. If you look back at the timeline, you might notice that over the past 2 years, it's been kind of quiet compared to before that. Not really that much has happened. We've gotten 2 big new releases, and obviously a bunch of minor versions, but really nobody's come up with any new ideas. We've sort of stalled a little bit. In 2015, 16, and 17, it was constant, right? Everybody had a new innovation, it felt like every week, which is awesome. So the reason I'm standing up here and I'm giving this talk is because we need you to create the future of styling React apps. We're not some kind of like magic people who invent stuff, right? Like, we just had ideas. If you have an idea, if you think you've got a good plan for how you could make styling your own React app easier, build it. Share it. Show it to me. I want to see it. Because we've reached a limit. We've reached a plateau, and I want us to go further. Now, if you do actually sit down and create a CSS-in-JS library, which please do that, and send it to me, because I want to take a look at it, I've got a couple tips for you. This applies to any open source project, but really I'm talking about CSS and JS libraries here. There's a very common progression with CSS and JS libraries. They start out with making it work. The first style components version was a horrible hack. We took post CSS, which is a thing that should be run by Node, and we made it run in the browser. And then we used that to compile the CSS down. The first version was a horrible hack, but it proved that we could make that API work. It proved that that API could be a thing. And what we did then was we shared it. We talked to people. We got feedback. We listened to their problems with it, the people that were using it. We kept improving it. Then the next step was that we made it right. The first version, we got some of the APIs right, but some of the APIs were kind of bad. And so we've progressively changed them and moved them to better APIs that give us certain other benefits. So the next step was that we made it right. And then the third step was that we made it fast. That was when we started focusing on performance, looking really deeply into all sorts of optimizations that we could do, really, again, kicked off by emotion, and we made it super fast. And I feel like open source projects should always start this way, because there's no point in over-engineering your library, right? There's no point in making it right and making it fast and spending months of effort if it's not the right API anyway. And the only way you're going to figure out if it is the right API or not is if you talk to people, if you share it, if people start using it and come back to you and saying, hey, this doesn't work super well, this works really well, I don't like this part, and you engage in a conversation. That's how you make a great open source project, right? That leads me right to my second point. Share early and share often. Share that hacky prototype that you whip up. Share that horrible code. Nobody cares. The first version of style components was a mess. It was 200 kilobytes of bundle size, min and gzip. It was massive. It was really badly architected. Did it matter? No. We were just trying to make it work. We were trying to share it to see how to make it right. It didn't matter. We shared early and we shared often. And that's why we got so much feedback, and that's why style components is as good as it is nowadays. It's only because we shared early and shared often and then listened to the feedback that we got back. And then a third and very important point that many people miss is that you have to document all the things. And I mean all the things. When we initially launched style components, I spent way more time on writing the documentation and actually building the library. Because if you don't have documentation, nobody's going to use your library because they don't know how to, right? You need to document all the things. And whenever I look at open source projects that have a README that say, npm install this library, that's it. I just go, what are you doing? Like, nobody's ever going to dig into your source code, right? People just want to solve their problem with your library. They don't care about your source code. So document all the things. All right, so to summarize, please build more CSS and JS libraries. If you have an idea, build it or come talk to me about it. I would love to hear about it. And if you do end up building an open source project, make it work, make it right, make it fast, share early, share often, and document all the things. Thank you, and I hope you're going to have a great conference.